I want to welcome everyone to our Humanitini here at the Tacoma branch of Busboys and Poets. My name is Jay Stewart. I am the Program Director for Humanities DC, also known as the Humanities Council of DC. And I want to thank you all for coming despite the weather, which I understand is going to turn to snow soon. I would also like to thank our host, Busboys and Poets. Specifically, I'd like to thank Alicia Bird, Denisha Bullock, and Patrick Bonesteel for their patience and help in putting this together. I'd also like to thank Chase, our on-site manager. I also want to point out Chris Galloway, a member of our board of directors in the back. And I'd like to recognize our staff. From the right, Stephanie Scott, our office administrator, Jasper Collier, the director of our digital museum, Diane Griffin, who is our Communications and Development Director, and Danielle Booz, our intern and a student at American University. I would also like to thank our honorary committee, which as of today includes every member of the DC Council, as well as our mayor, Muriel Bowser, and selected a number of local DC government officials from the planning office and elsewhere. I'd like to recognize Patsy Fletcher, speaking of, from the Historic Preservation Office, who's here in the audience. And also, finally, I'd like to thank our sponsors, DC Brow, Busboys and Poets, and a Creative DC. Okay, let me tell you a little bit about Humanities DC and about what a Humanitini is. Humanities DC is an independent nonprofit affiliate of the National Endowment for the Humanities, the federal agency in charge of supporting the humanities throughout the United States. Humanities DC is an essential part of the district's effort to provide quality humanities-related programs that preserve Washington's cultural legacy and promote civic engagement in every neighborhood in DC. This year marks the 225th anniversary of the founding of the District of Columbia. As part of this event, starting in January and continuing monthly for the rest of the year, we are holding panel discussions of scholars and contemporary commentators to discuss the highlights of a series of 20-year periods in the history of this great city and to link the events of the past to present-day issues and concerns of district residents. Humanities DC hopes to illuminate the often overlooked local history of the nation's capital and to define aspects of a unique contemporary culture of the district. Given the cultural and economic changes taking place in this city, we believe that reflecting on what our history has to teach us about the present is both timely and important. Today we will discuss the topic of the District of Columbia in relation to its suburbs, Arlington, Alexandria, Montgomery County, and Prince George's County. The time period which forms the basis for our discussion is the era between 1851 and 1831. This is a time when the Commonwealth of Virginia retroceded or took back the Virginia part of DC. When Andrew Ellicott and Benjamin Banneker initially set the boundary lines of DC in the 1790s, the jurisdiction included present-day Arlington and part of the City of Alexandria. Congress intended for the district to have a diamond shape, stretching 10 miles square. Virginia's decision in 1846 to take back Alexandria County, as Arlington and Alexandria were then known, shattered the diamond. This decision also had the effect of creating the first suburb beyond the city limits. Today we will hear from a panel of experts drawn from all four of the suburbs immediately adjacent to DC. They will tell you about the experiences today of people living and working in the suburbs, or more often living in the suburbs while working in DC. These suburbs have their own unique character, but they also contribute to the history and culture of the area known colloquially as the DMV, meaning the greater DC area. So I'd like to take a minute to recognize one of our board members who just walked in, Marjan Shalal. I guess she may have stepped out briefly. But I'd also like to identify our panelists. So starting on the farthest from me, I'd like to recognize Adrian Terrell Washington, an adjunct professor of English at Northern Virginia Community College, Alexandria campus. Adrian will be our moderator for the evening. Clap at the end. John Westbay is the curator and chief operating officer of the Prince George's County African American Museum. He will soon be on his way to the University of Maryland University College as a curator, I believe, of their collections. Is that right? So congratulations to you for that. Seated to his left is Mayor Kate Stewart. The Honorable Kate Stewart is the mayor of Tacoma Park, Maryland, which is right over there, for those who don't know. And finally, Craig Syfax is the president of the Black Heritage Museum of Arlington, Virginia. So with no further ado, I'll hand things over to Adrian, our moderator.
What we're going to do to begin with is each one of us will speak about the period and about the work that we're doing in the various suburbs. The area we all call, the young people rather, started calling the DMV, which is District, Maryland, and Virginia. And, when you go out of town or you go across the big water, somebody asks you where you're from. You never say you're from Virginia or Maryland. You say you're from Washington, D.C., right? Even if you live in Prince George's County or you live in Montgomery County, a lot of people will say they live in Washington, D.C. And the younger people have more connection because, I believe, of the transportation access that they have through Metro and through Uber and rideshare. They get around a lot better than people in our generation who stuck to whatever jurisdiction we were born in and lived in. It's amazing how they are able to go to all sorts of events and meet each other through social media, what they call meetups. And that kind of thing, and which I think is a really good thing because it does bring in people that don't normally come into DC, and it also takes people from DC out to the suburbs where they may never have traveled before, and that's why I'm glad that we're having this program today, because you get to see how those of us across one bridge or another live. People might not be aware, but the 14th Street Bridge used to be called the Long Bridge. Free African Americans went back and forth walking across the Long Bridge until the Civil War, when they pulled up the planks so that the Southerners, the Confederates, couldn't come across the Long Bridge. But one of the things that happens in the time period that we're discussing, the period between 1831 and 1851, was the Pearl Affair, which is when a group of slaves were able to escape on a schooner. And then, unfortunately, one of us gave the rest of them up to the master and said, you know that they got away. And the schooner, it was wind-powered. And it got all the way down to like Mount Vernon, and the wind died. And that gave the white posse a chance to gather and go for them. And they captured them and sent most of those slaves to Louisiana. But what you might not be aware is there's a group of women, there were two women, they were called the Edmondson Sisters. The Edmondson Sisters, there is a statue, even today, in Alexandria for remembering the Edmondson Sisters. It's on Duke Street. If you get a chance, Duke Street in Alexandria not only has the Edmondson Sisters statue is located right where the Bruin slave pen was. That was part of the redevelopment of that area. And if you go down 3 blocks, you will be at the Urban League's office, where if you go in the basement, there's still the slave pen with the shackles and everything else on the wall. So you may not know, but Alexandria has a lot of history with regard to African Americans, because a lot of contraband went there. And I am involved in a project called the Fort Ward Project, and this has been circulating around the room. And we have put in some signs at Fort Ward, one of the forts that many African Americans developed communities around the forts, the Civil War, like Fort DuPont, Fort Reno, things like that you're familiar with. So even though you don't think that the suburbs still has a connection today to DC, there is, and there are lots of historic sites, as these, everybody will will let you know about that. You can go on the web, at least in Alexandria, you can go on the web for the Office of Historic Alexandria, and there is a listing of all the African American sites that are still available, and if you want to ask questions about that later, we'll take that. I'm going to pass off now. We'll go to Prince George's County. We'll go to Tacoma Park in Maryland, and then we'll come back to Virginia and Arlington. How's that?
How's it going, everybody? All right, well, I'm John Westbay. I'm the Chief Curator and Acting Executive Director until tomorrow. So I'm just gonna go out on a limb and say, if you haven't been to the Prince George's African American Museum, you can go until tomorrow for free and tell them that I said it. It's my last day, what can they do? So, but if you haven't been to the Prince George's African American Museum, you absolutely should. It's a great place, and it's been open since 2010. I've been there since 2010, and we've done, about 14 exhibits in those years. We've done exhibits that specifically relate to African American life, arts, and culture in Prince George's County. And you know, if you haven't been to Prince George's County, there isn't one place that you can say is a Prince George's County place. There's some rural areas, there are very urban areas, there are, it's home to the largest population of highest educated and high income African Americans in the country. And so there are suburbs. There are just so many places that make up Prince George's County, and you'll see a lot of those exhibits if you go to the museum, which you will for free tomorrow because I said so. Now, after tomorrow, I can't promise anything. So, you know, I can talk a little bit more about Prince George's County. I have to confess that I don't live in Prince George's County, so I live in Southeast DC. And so I talk about it as someone who works there and it does not live there. So I can just tell you from people that I've interacted with that are Prince Georgians, they're very proud of Prince George's County and all it has accomplished in the last, you know, since its existence, but especially in the last 20 years. And so I think that's all. I'm going to stop there, and then we'll talk a little bit more about some other things that are related to Prince George's County. Yeah.
Thank you. Hi, I'm Kate Stewart. I'm the mayor of Tacoma Park, Maryland. I'm glad to be here this evening. I'd just like to recognize first Diana Cohen, who's the president of Historic Tacoma. So, in fact, if you actually have any questions about the history of Tacoma Park, Maryland, or Tacoma, DC, she's your woman. But I'm very glad to be here this evening. In Tacoma Park, Maryland, we like to say we live on the edge because we are right near Washington, D.C., Prince George's County, and we're in the southernmost part of Montgomery County. We have a really interesting history in Tacoma Park, one that is very closely related with Tacoma, D.C. In fact, our origin started back in the 1880s, when, if you can imagine for a moment what it looked like here in the 1880s, it looked very different. It was actually a lot of thick forest, not many stores or shops, but we had a railroad. It was one of 3 railroad stations in the area where people could get out of downtown DC. And that was the attraction for a man named B.F. Gilbert, who was a wealthy New Yorker. All roads lead back to New York. And he came down here and he purchased 100 acres. And the land was on both sides of the railroad track. So some of it was in Maryland and some of it was in DC. But that didn't bother B.F. Gilbert, because the reason he was here was because it was a lot nicer to breathe the air here and it wasn't as crowded. So if you can imagine the late 1800s in DC, it was crowded and it was hot. And so if you had money, one of the things that happened is that people came and moved out here, or they spent their summers here. So they'd come out and this would be their summer place. And by 1885, we had about 100 residents living in both Tacoma, DC, and Tacoma, Maryland. And the community grew up together, basically. There was very little distinction between the Maryland side and the DC side. When Tacoma Park incorporated in the later 1880s, it just took the Maryland side. It didn't take any of the other part of DC. But still, the communities worked together. They'd lobby together for the library, schools. Sometimes children in the Maryland side would go to the DC schools. And they had this relationship. Now, like any long-term relationship, sometimes there's togetherness, and sometimes you go your own way. And that happened after World War II. Tacoma Park really started focusing on other things, and the DC side focused on really its own close-in neighborhoods. But it wasn't long until the 1960s that the two communities came back together again to fight against what was going to be a 10-lane freeway from the beltway all the way through here to the National Mall. So can you imagine that? We would not be sitting here today. There would be a 10-lane freeway here. But thankfully, because of the long-standing relationships between residents in DC and on the Maryland side, they got together and they fought hard. And what ended up happening is we didn't get a freeway, but we got a metro. And what we also got was historic distinction in both the DC side and the Maryland side, which has been integral to preserving our communities. So like I said, any relationships, sometimes there's togetherness, sometimes you go apart. I like to think, as the mayor of Tacoma Park now, that we're entering another time of great togetherness. Restaurants like Busboys and Poets here on the DC side. We have Republic and Kinda and Mark's Kitchen on the Maryland side. We have wonderful shops and other businesses that we work together. In fact, there's a local business here, Rhizome, that received a grant from the Tacoma Park City Council, even though it's on the DC side. So there's a lot of togetherness, and I'm hoping that we will continue that in the near future.
My name is Craig Syfax. I am president of the Black Heritage Museum of Arlington, Virginia. Arlington is known as the bedroom to the government because most of the people in the government live in Arlington, and because it's an easy commute. Arlington began at Robert E. Lee's house. That is the name where Arlington's name came from. The George Washington Parke Custis built the house that Robert E. Lee lived in, and it was called Arlington, so that was where they chose the name at the time to call it Arlington. Arlington has 3 black neighborhoods that came out of the origin of Freedmen's Village, which happened out of emancipation. And Arlington also has highly ranked schools in the nation, and we boast that we have the most college degrees in one area in this area. I don't want to talk much because I want to hear what you all have to say and what you want to ask and why you're here. So with that, let's continue.
Just briefly, I would be remiss if I didn't mention the historical events that happened in our time period that we are talking about historically, which is 1831 to 1851. And that included what you may not be familiar with, which was the snow riots. There was a riot on Pennsylvania Avenue, 1831, at a Beverly Snow was a free black man who had a very posh restaurant, and because of some things that happened, a white mob started to tear that apart, and that was one of the first riots race riots in the District of Columbia. We are all familiar with the story 12 Years a Slave. Solomon Northrop in 1841 was captured in the District of Columbia in the Gadsby Hotel on the Hill. We also know that the reason why DC is only 69 miles now instead of 100 miles is because in 1846, that's when the vote happened that Virginia got Alexandria and Arlington went back to Virginia, and that is why we no longer have a diamond. It's cut off at the bottom. And Frederick Douglass published the first North Star in 1847. I mentioned to you the Pearl Affair in 1848. And I don't know if you all are familiar with Matilda Minor. Matilda Minor is a white woman from Massachusetts who came to D.C. and opened up a school for colored girls. And that school taught girls how to be secretaries and teachers. And that school is the seed of UDC today. So she does not get the recognition. It used to be Minors Teachers College. Is still on Howard University's campus. So I just wanted you to know that during this period, there's a lot of abolitionist work. A lot of abolitionists came here, and this is part of the reason why Virginia went back to, Alexandria and Arlington went back to Virginia, because the Virginians were afraid that Alexandria would become free, and then that would set up Virginia not to continue to have the slave trade, and that was one of their biggest commerce at that time. So one of the questions we wanted to ask of the panel is, I just answered that question about retrosection. I wanted to ask, let's see, what does they got here? Why is Prince George's County called Ward 9?
That's you.
Why is Prince George's County called Ward 9? And again, this is from somebody who is not from DC or Prince George's County. So I'm only repeating what I've heard. So
we'll take that disclaimer.
I don't want anybody to follow me out into the parking lot. Okay? All right. My understanding is that, there was a large African American population, of course, always in the district and especially in Southeast DC. And with movement of people from, for development, with movement from people from certain areas of Washington, D.C., a lot of them ended up moving out into Prince George's County and having roots in D.C. And so even today, even with a lot of work that we do at the museum, there are a lot of people who have relatives that still live specifically in Ward 8 and kind of travel back and forth. So there's because so many people in Prince George's County have roots that go into D.C., specifically across that southeast border, it's considered Ward 9. From what I understand, it can also be offensive to some people. So that's why I say, don't follow me out into the parking lot. I'm just repeating what I've heard. But with that said, there's a lot of great things about the culture, the kind of cross culture that you see with DC and with Prince George's County. There are a lot of people who make very sharp distinctions, but there are a lot of similarities between people across those borders.
Right. Well, one of the reasons it's called Ward 9 is because people historically like to give credit to Marion Barry for the workforce that he developed during his tenure that created a black middle class that then could afford to go to Prince George's County. But you're right, a lot of people bristle at the notion that they're Ward 9. And what about when you say PG County? How do people feel about that?
Yeah, again, so there have been some people that are very offended by the term PG as opposed to saying Prince George's County. And matter of fact, when I first started working at Prince George's African American Museum, I made the mistake of saying PG, and I got a lecture about why we should say Prince George's African American Museum. So right now, that's why I don't even use PG in any of my normal speech. I think part of it is that calling it PG means that it's less than something. So it's not there's no other, or how it's been explained to me is there aren't any other counties, like nobody abbreviates Arlington or Alexandria or even Montgomery, even though there are some abbreviations for it. And so people will say all these other full names of the counties, but then refer to Prince George's as PG. And then there's another piece of it that likens it to DC. So you say DC and PG with these two very short abbreviations. And I think some Prince Georges look at it as wanting their own identity. So by saying Prince George's, you're acknowledging that there's something very unique and different about it. But aside from being unique and different, there are lots of different areas of Prince George's County that have very different identities as well. So you have, Capitol Heights, which feels very different than Upper Marlboro. That feels very different than Hyattsville. And I don't think there's any one place that you can say is specifically Prince George's County, because there are lots of different experiences there.
Okay.
So
Thank you. You mentioned, Mayor.
got through that one.
Yes. You mentioned, Mayor, that there is some interaction between Tacoma Park, D.C. and Tacoma Park, Maryland. But do they share a common identity, and what attracts people to Tacoma Park in general?
Well, as I mentioned before, back in the 1960s, there was a national attention brought to this area because of the fight against the freeway. And it was at that time that Tacoma Park, especially on the Maryland side, became known as the Berkeley of the East, or the Republic of Tacoma Park. And so it became known for its liberal views. We're also a nuclear-free zone. So that image really began during the 1960s.
Today you would be progressives?
I think today, yes, it would be progressives. And our history with Tacoma, D.C., as I said before, there's a lot of great things in common. Unlike, I think, with Virginia, it's hard to know where the boundary is. There is still the stone that you can see out here, but it's, very few people actually know here's where D.C. starts and here's where Maryland starts. In fact, I've had many conversations with representatives on the D.C. side about who owns certain streets and sidewalks.
I bet that was interesting.
And even sometimes our police departments get a little bit confused. But that's why cooperation is very important.
But when people say Tacoma Park, they do think of very liberal,
yes,
Birkenstock, things like that.
Yes, tie-dye, yes.
Tree huggers.
Yes. Yeah.
That kind of thing. So I was going to say, there is a common identity with that. How much does the metro attract young people to Tacoma Park? Because it's so centrally located.
It is centrally located, and in the last few years, we've actually seen a great change in the area. It's not only the metro has been here for a while, but also opening of restaurants like here, Busboys and Poets. This is just amazing to have in our community, not only because of the amazing food that you're all eating in front of me, and I have not eaten dinner yet, so I will forgive you for that, but also what Busboys and Poets does in terms of bringing together a community. And we have a number, and that's one of the things that we have in common on the DC side and the Maryland side, is that our businesses and our restaurants, they do more for the community. They're community gathering places for people to come together, and that's what keeps us close.
Yeah, I saw that line out there when we came in. Mr. Safax, I just want to let people know that the Safax name is very prominent in Arlington. He did not mention that. And in D.C. as well. And they owned a lot of land, right? Your family in D.C., which is now downtown D.C. at one point. And they have really kept up the African American heritage in Arlington. So I want to thank you for your family for all the work that you all do in Arlington that people are not familiar with. Let me ask you this. Do you think that the Potomac River creates a barrier between D.C. residents and Arlington, with the exception of maybe Georgetown and Roslyn? I mean, you see people going across the Key Bridge back and forth, but otherwise, I wonder how many people are making that trek across the river.
In the beginning, if we go back to the retrocession itself, the reason Virginia Well, I would say the effects that it had on Virginia was George Washington owned the Mount Vernon, Alexandria side, and George Washington Park Custis owned from like the rest of Alexandria to the Memorial Bridge. So those two had like the main. Had a monopoly on the charter on the shore there, the commerce that came in that way. So George Washington, with his mind, he thought that he didn't want to have a monopoly. He wanted to make it open for everyone. And he thought that the retrocession would cause that by bringing commerce to the area, but it only made him and the other guy more wealthy than anyone else. Back to your question. Arlington being the bedroom of the government, so everyone travels back and forth across that way. The water seems to be something that people enjoy on the 4th of July. You know, on both sides. They stay in the middle and watch the fireworks from there. But Arlington enjoys the skyline that we see, and I'm sure DC looks at our skyline and enjoys that. Am I
Does
close?
does the water itself create a natural barrier or boundary that doesn't allow people to cross over as freely as Maryland and DC are contiguous? So, you know, people just have to drive on the street. But when you say, I'm going to Virginia, people are like, you got to go over to Woodruff, you got to go over the Key Bridge, you got to go over one of those bridges, right? I don't, you know, and we know that the Woodrow Wilson Bridge is owned by all three jurisdictions. Half of the bridge is Virginia, half the bridge is Maryland, and the water underneath is DC. So there's the true DMV point. But it seems that going over a bridge or going across the water doesn't have the people from Virginia mingling as well with DC as the people from Maryland. Would you agree to that?
I would agree to that now because Arlington is bustling. They have Clarendon, they have Roslyn, they have Shirlington, they have Westover. We have places that are self-contained now, and people like to live where they work and socialize as well. But DC is still a place that people travel to, like to the Verizon Center to see the Wizards or the Caps, or either sporting or music event at the 930 Club. But I don't think and the subway is a great access, point for people to get to and fro.
So do you think, either of you, that the suburbs have the same taboo or the same distance from the city or disconnect from the city as it did maybe 10, 20 years ago when Arlington was more of a bedroom community in terms of commuters, and just people went home and they didn't come back into the city to do cross events?
There used to be talk of taxing the Virginians for coming into D.C. Of course, I'm against that. But to even talk about that, taxing to coming back and forth like that, to put a toll on that, that would definitely cause some problems for Virginia to come into D.C. at that point. But other than that, I don't see any other problem.
The big question is, D.C. does not have voting rights. And there have been a number of ideas thrown out. One being that Maryland, that D.C. is retroceded to Maryland so that they can have voting rights, or that D.C. takes back the Virginia territory. What do either of you say about those ideas? Nobody wants to touch that question.
Well, I'll just say, in Tacoma Park, Maryland, we feel very strongly about voting rights. In our local city elections, 16 and 17-year-olds can vote. Undocumented residents can vote in our local elections, and those who have committed a felony and are out on parole can also vote. So I think you would have strong support from residents of Tacoma Park to work very hard on finding a solution to get voting rights in D.C.
Okay. Arlington and Alexandria back to D.C.?
I don't see that happening at all. Arlington and Alexandria are self-contained, and they have their own identity now. I don't think they would want to be or collaborate as that again.
Okay.
My personal.
Okay. Thank you all. I want to go ahead and ask questions of the audience now. If you have questions for our panelists regarding the suburbs and its interaction or not with the center city area. Used to be, as we know, that DC was just a place you came to work and then you went home if you lived in the suburbs. But that, as I say, has thankfully changed in a lot of ways. Yes, sir, the gentleman in the back.
Good evening, everyone. I just wanted to make a couple comments on the Ward 9. This is just in Ward 9. It's often referred to Prince George's County as being Ward 9. Many years ago, when I was studying this stuff, I was looking at the census data, and in 1980, for the 1980s, the absolute drop in population in terms of numbers matched the absolute increase in the number of African Americans in Prince George's County. So the drop in the number of black people living in the district matched the number of black people who moved to Prince George's County. Now clearly black folks were moving to Virginia and Montgomery County, so part of the designation as Ward 9 is really part of the black suburbanization movement. And while we focus a lot in DC on gentrification and displacement, there has not been as much attention given to the black suburbanization phenomena. And because Prince George's County is also known as the first predominantly black middle class suburb in terms of its income and wealth and so forth. So it carries both those designations. And regarding the highway movement, there was a book written many years ago called Highways to Nowhere, and it documented communities across the United States who stopped highways. Barbara McCulsey got her start in Baltimore by stopping the highways coming through Baltimore City, and story after story. So when I tell the story, I say, if you ever come into DC and you get around New York Avenue, you come under the tunnel and it just kind of gets confusing. Everybody had that experience? Well, that's where the highway was going to pick up. 95 was going to come through the district, as the mayor indicated, up through this part of town. And at that time, according to the transportation plans, almost 70 to 80% of the District of Columbia would have been highways. And so it shows the significance. The other story I tell is you're coming in from Northern Virginia and come up 66, and you get to New Georgetown, and it all gets kind of confusing. Well, it was supposed to be something called the Three Sisters Bridge that was going to come across the river and go into Georgetown, but there was another community that stopped that. So we get these strange highways to nowhere. You get these strong communities that have built themselves as a result of being able to stop that movement.
While he's going towards him, yes, there is now a large African American community in Prince William County in Virginia, to the point that it's got a designation as a majority district. And there had to be a federal judge who approved that, because the Republicans in the Virginia legislature wanted to make a funny district that went all the way from Norfolk to Richmond, which is crazy. And then they wanted to do a district below Alexandria, below Fairfax County, where a number of those people are now living, as you pointed out.
I was just curious about the African American Museum in Prince George's County. So is it the one on Route 1 that you're talking about? Yes. So I know the period of time that you're talking about here, from 1831 to 1851. But I'm just curious if because there's such a rich history about Blanche Bruce in Prince George's County. He owned the plantation and all of that there. Do you have any of that information in your museum, or have you done anything on that at all? Because I don't think there's a lot that people know about that history. I'm just curious as to why, I've never really heard anything about his.
Yeah, the short answer is no. There isn't anything currently there about Blanche Bruce at all. However, there's a lot of great stuff there if you want to, yeah.
There's just so much history there in that county, and especially with his whole family. That's just a fascinating story. So.
Can you tell us about the Blanche Bruce and who he was?
Well, he was the first full-time senator. Oh, I'm sorry. He was the first, what would you call it, full-term black senator. And so he essentially was like, I guess you could say that he and his family had the first black dynasty in America. Because of all the property that they owned and the influence that he had. And, he lived in the district, but his wife, his son actually, if I'm not mistaken, Roscoe Bruce started like the school board in the district. He was one of the first people to start like the school board here, who had a great deal of connection to the school on the hill. In DC, what's that called? In Northwest. They used to call it the school on the hill. No.
McKinley?
I'm sorry? No. It's off of 13th Street? Cardozo. Yeah. So, he's just a fascinating character that I never hear anything about.
However, you could go there tomorrow and you could tell them to do some sort of exhibit about it, yeah.
Don't forget, you can go free tomorrow. Thanks.
Go free tomorrow.
Any questions?
Hi, I have a couple of questions. The first one is probably stupid of mine. Oh, this, hey. Everybody, I don't know how to do it. Okay? No, this isn't working. Hello? Yeah. Okay, I was always told, I think, that the people who moved from DC to Prince George's a lot of them were the people who were displaced in Southwest by the urban renewal over there. And what I wonder is, that was considered a ghetto, and that's why it was supposedly redeveloped. And I know there's been a huge amount of controversy about whether it ever should have been. Those people should have been displaced. But what I was wondering is, how did that population go from being ghetto to, in Prince George's, being the biggest middle-class African-American population around? That's one question. I mean, maybe they all, I don't know. But then the other completely different question that occurred to me is we're talking about racial multiculturalism. But I wanted to ask about Tacoma Park and the influence of the Adventist influence on Tacoma Park, which to me it seems very interesting. How did it manifest itself, and how is it still influencing?
Okay, let's take the first question about the black middle class in Prince George's County, and did it originate in Southwest?
Yeah, so, again, there are several places from DC that Prince George's County residents ended up coming from. There's a whole history of Southwest. There's a whole history of displacement from Southeast and other areas from the city. So I don't want to give the impression that there's that the majority of Prince George's County people from DC that moved to Prince George's County came from a particular area. So there are multiple areas and multiple stories. And I know that the Anacostia Museum is doing a research project about displacement into Prince George's County from Southeast and have some really interesting research about that. I can only emphasize again that when you talk about the wealth and the high levels of education of African American populations in Prince George's County, that there are just different populations all over the county, and I wouldn't make a direct link between displaced populations from anywhere in DC and what and populations that are wealthy, and that there's a history behind that too. And I would tie it in the museum. We did an exhibition a few years ago about African Americans that came home after World War II, and I think the biggest link that you can find between African American wealth and education in Prince George's County is the federal government and civil service jobs. And so you had your first wave of folks that, you know, would start out at a very low level, work their way up, and then, you know, their kids would start working for the government. They could afford enough money to be able to buy a big house and to send their kids to college. And so I think that's probably more of a link. Jobs are probably more of a link, and specifically federal government jobs are probably more of a link to the high number of African Americans who are highly educated and have wealth than displacement. So I hope I answered your question. Yeah.
I don't know if she was speaking of the displacement in the 60s or the displacement more recent.
Well, I think more, I don't know. Because, and that's why I said it was a stupid question.
No question is a stupid question.
Because what I had understood from my friend Keith Melder is that a huge wave came from the displacement in Southwest, and that that many of those people in Southwest that were displaced were really very upwardly mobile and interesting, doing very interesting things, and that this is one of the, it just, this mass displacement. And then once they got out there to Prince George's, they were able to thrive. So I don't know, I just was wondering about.
I would suggest to you there were two waves. I think you're talking about when Southwest was taken over by the federal government in HUD during the that was in the 60s when we had what was called urban renewal, and we called it urban removal because I lived on Half Street as a child. Then there's the second wave of displacement, which occurs with the baseball stadium. That is, that population was of a lower income level, but they too were displaced when they got rid of a number of the public housing, apartments down there. And it began that wave of gentrification. Mainly, the impetus there was the baseball stadium. And if you go down to the baseball stadium, and you all know now, it doesn't look anything like what it used to. Now, the second question you had, we'll direct to the mayor about the Adventists in Tacoma Park.
So the Seventh-day Adventist came to Tacoma Park in the early 1900s, and it was their world headquarters for a number of years until, what is it, Diane? 1980s, until the 1980s. And so even though Tacoma Park, Maryland, is relatively small, we're about 2.4 square miles, we actually have two rather large Adventist churches in Tacoma Park. One is, you can see, is kind of our entranceway here in Tacoma Park. It's a beautiful church. And the other is on Flower Avenue. We also have a number of Seventh-day Adventist schools in our community still. And I think the fact that the Seventh-day Adventists had their world headquarters here, there was a number of things that occurred because of that. One of the interesting things is some of the deeds to the houses actually used to say in them that you couldn't have alcohol in your home or serve alcohol, because that's something the Seventh-day Adventists do not believe in, is drinking alcohol. So actually people up until relatively recently still had that written into their deeds. But I think the very unique thing about having, as we were talking about before, about Tacoma Park being a progressive place, a place, people talk about hippies and other things, but also being a place that's the world headquarters for religion like the Seventh-day Adventists, just shows the diversity of the community. For being, 17,000 people, 2.4 square miles, we have a lot of different people packed in there.
More questions? Yes, this lady.
Okay, so I guess my question is, and I'm not an original DMV resident or anything. I'm coming, migrating from the south here, and as an educator, and I guess as a community, my question is, in TP County, since you all have that rich history about, that African Americans been upwardly mobile and affluent and educated, how does that filter into the education system in TP County now?
Prince George's County.
Just gonna give me all the hard questions on my last day. My last day. I think like a lot of counties, Prince George's County also has its challenges, and I think that the county executive is doing what I think he can to make sure that the school system has its proper funding. I think it's had a long history of trying to make sure that they can serve the needs of different generations of kids that are coming into the schools. And I can only tell you that Prince George's African American Museum has a great relationship and wants to continue to have a relationship with the Prince George's County schools, and is currently serving 41 locations with arts programming related to Prince George's County African American arts and history. So I think that there's challenges, and I think that there are great, smart people dealing with those challenges. The museum is hopefully helping, and that's about all I'm going to say about that. Yeah.
Could I add to that? I'm not supposed to step in, but I did a paper on this. Maryland had, Prince George's County, Maryland specifically, had something similar to what happened in California in the 1970s called a tax reform. So school systems are funded primarily through property taxes. And as Prince George's County was transitioning from being majority white to majority black, a vote took place in 1978 for something called TRIM. And I can't remember what it stands for in acronym. But TRIM imposed what's called a supermajority requirement on raising property taxes. Meaning, in the past, people could vote 51% to raise property taxes to increase funding for schools. After TRIM was put in place, you had to have a 70% vote in order to increase funding for schools, and the black population was roughly around 70%. So it made it harder for people to raise taxes to fund schools. So effectively, the funding base for Prince George's County schools was frozen at 1978 levels. If you can imagine, before computers, before the internet, before everything, from 1978 up until about 2 years ago. And Rush Baker III, the executive of Prince George's County, finally figured out a legal loophole to get around TRIM and increase revenue for the schools. But from 1978 to 2014, roughly, the schools were trapped in a 1978 framework. So that goes a long way toward explaining the unfunding, the defunding of Prince George's County schools, despite the fact that it was majority black and very affluent jurisdiction.
And I think, correct me if I'm wrong, they had to get, you still had to get state approval to remove TRIM. He had to lobby in Annapolis to get that removed.
So the question I have is, with the Redskins essentially moving out of the, sorry about it, so what do you think the financial impact was prior to them coming to Prince George's County versus how it's going to affect the county immediately? And how it may also affect DC and maybe Virginia as well in terms of being a little bit closer?
I like the Redskins, and I like them being in Prince George's County, but I understand that they have to make the best decision that they have to make. I think that it's probably done very well for Prince George's County, and I think it's part of a larger strategy to attract businesses, and I don't know what's going to happen in the future, but I think the impact has been good.
Jay just mentioned that Prince George's County went from being predominantly white to predominantly black. So we're talking about predominantly black suburb too. But similarly, there were always folks in the so-called suburbs, like Virginia and Maryland were the biggest slaveholding states. And then after the Civil War, a lot of the black folks stayed there, but also a lot of them moved across the river or down the road into D.C. and Georgetown. And then in terms of moving to the suburbs, so here's my question, and that's just a comment. Have you considered who were the people who left D.C., like in terms of moving to the burbs, who were the people who left D.C. in 1950, 1954, especially after school desegregation and the so-called white flight? Who were the people who moved to Arlington, for instance? Who were the people who moved to Tacoma Park? Initially, a lot of white folks moved to Prince George's County. And when I say who were they, like you said, Tacoma Park has a reputation for being very liberal. So aside from the Adventist church, and not that the Adventists are really all that liberal, right. And I have a lot of Adventists in my family, so it's not about Adventism. But who were the liberals who moved to Tacoma Park? And then who were the people who moved from D.C. into Arlington? And who were the people who moved to Prince George's
I can start from Freedman's Village. When they disbanded Freedman's Village, they created the 3 black neighborhoods in Arlington. They also created a tent city where the Pentagon is now that was called Queen City. It was mainly trailers, but it was commonly known as like a tent city, Queen City. And so when they said we're building the Pentagon and you people have to leave, a majority of them went to D.C. What parts I couldn't tell you, but they migrated into D.C. and the rest stayed close into South Arlington. And that's the best answer I can give you for that.
And you have lots of people in Virginia who are second, third, fourth generation, fifth generation Virginians who just stayed in Virginia. And we know that with the forts I mentioned earlier, the forts that ringed the city during the Civil War, that once after the 1851 Confiscation Act, which said if you could get to a fort, they wouldn't send you back, even though the Fugitive Slave Act was enacted at that time. So many people just picked up a sack and went to the closest fort that they could find that ringed the city. And we see that those communities like ours is 150 years old. We know that, at least 150 years old around Fort Ward. And it's just similar to what's happened. You see now, you can still see vestiges of those communities, and those people did not move. They stayed there.
Where exactly was Freedman's Village? Where was it?
Freedman Village is right where Henderson Hall is today. It is 17 acres, and this is what the Park Service told me, it sits right there where Henderson Hall is, and Henderson Hall sits on 17 acres. If you know where the Sheraton is on Columbia Pike, It's the Henderson Hall is behind it.
Do you know how many people actually live there? I mean, what was the population?
I forgot what the estimate.
Oh, that's a good question. I do know that answer.
17,000? Was it 17?
I will go with 17,000 with what.
It was a very big. I mean, it wasn't a village. You know, it could have counted as a city. Yeah.
And Freedman's Village came about because during the emancipation, there was a migration to this area, to Washington, D.C. So that caused an outbreak of smallpox. So then the government had to get together with an organization called the AMA, which was a women's group that helped the wounded soldiers and everything. They provided medical assistance to the military. So the military went to them and said, how do we combat this smallpox outbreak? They said, we need to contain this and work with it from there. So then they worked together and said that we will build this place called Freedman's Village, which was the model for the rest of the South when they ran upon people who were free and there were just a mob of them. So while they, well, one thing to talk. So the Freedman's Village got their 17 acres because Mariah Syfax was willed the property through George Washington Parke Custis. He owned the property of Arlington Cemetery. And Robert E. Lee married his daughter. Right. That's why Robert E. Lee was even on the property. So when the Union soldiers won and they wanted to put a black eye or some sort of trophy on his property, they said, we'll build a cemetery. And they built it in the farthest corner of where Freedman's Village was. And they built the graves in that direction and told them, we're coming this way, so now you have to disband.
Right. And I want to correct myself. I said 1851. I meant 1861. And that's when we have the great contraband movement. Yes. Other questions? Yes.
Race slavery played a role in the retrocession of Virginia away from D.C. Part of that dynamic is also around what we now call statehood or representation. What happened when the folks from Virginia and Maryland ended up in Washington, D.C., they realized they had lost their voting rights. And so the struggle for home rule and statehood really begins very early on in 1790 and kind of continues up through today. And so one of the reasons was because of the attempt to get back so they could vote for congressmen and senators and so forth. So that's part of the history. Also, around 1848, 1840s, we began to get black elected officials in the District of Columbia. Often we talk about black elected officials starting with Walter Washington, but actually the first mayor was 1812, not with Walter Washington. And so part of the struggle, by the time you get to the 1870s, I think there were like 8 wards in the District of Columbia, and 4 or 5 of those wards had black aldermen at that time. So part of the struggle, I would say, was around race, but it was also around representation as well.
Right, right. The 3 reasons they gave was the slave trade, the lack of voting rights, and the fact that the federal government did not put any federal buildings in Virginia, and those people were very upset. They felt like stepchildren, and so for those 3 reasons, they wanted to go back to be part of Virginia.
Okay, there are no further questions. I'd like to thank our panel for coming tonight. I'd also like to introduce a couple of our board members who've shown up, Yolanda Corda and Marjan Shalal. Our executive director who asked me not to single her out. Oh, Chris, we already introduced earlier. Joy Ford Austin, our director, is seated down in front. And And also Louis Hicks, our Director of Development, is there in the back. We'll be accepting grant applications tomorrow. For those who are working on them, just go back and finish them tonight and send them in. I had a couple of announcements I wanted to make before we break. The first one concerns Louis, actually. And Louis, if you could talk very briefly about our grant program, that would be good. And Louis used to be the director of the Alexandria Black History Museum before he came on board at Humanitini.
Thanks, Dave. Very quickly, I'd like to talk about our next grant cycle, which is the DCCHD. We did a really quick run on getting our workshops organized. Our next series of grants is in cooperation with the Preservation Office here in the city. And it basically allows laymen to have a close contact and a personal way of telling a story about DC's history. It culminates in a showcase in December. The grant period will start. Grant applications will go online effective tomorrow on March 4th. It's a DC Community Heritage Project program. And we will have a series of training programs to help you learn how to write grants. Also to create effective oral histories as part of that. We have had several come into our office, which eventually will get mounted onto our digital museum. Our grant workshops will occur on Tuesday, April 5th at 6 to 8:30 p.m. at the Benning Library in Northeast. Monday, April 11th at the Shaw Library right down the street from the Humanities Office at 1630 7th Street. And on Wednesday, the 13th, from 6 to 8:30. In case you're not able to make the evening activities, we're also going to have them from 11 to 1:30. The hour and a half program will actually allow you to have the initial ways of writing a grant, and then the later part of the program, your oral history, will train you in the techniques. I was also advised to make sure that we are aware of our raffle. We have a door prize that Jay will bring up Diane to talk about the door prize.
Yes, I'd like to invite Diane Griffin, our Community Development Director, up to talk about the raffle and also to introduce members of her family who are in the audience, and then I will introduce members of my family who are in the audience.
Okay, thank you. Hello, everyone. Welcome again to Humanitini. I am Diane, and I am the Director of Development and Communications. Louis is our Director of Grants. So if you are confused about the two, I handle the money that comes to us. He handles the money that comes from us. So people always get confused about the difference in our two roles. As I do handle the money that comes to us, one of the things that we like to do at Humanitini is offer up a raffle or door prize of donated goods. And we have some goods that have been given to us by DC Brown, who is one of our sponsors. So everyone should have gotten a raffle ticket. Do you have your tickets? All right, I'm going to have Jay come up. Hold your eyes. Okay, ready? We have another ticket? One more? Hold on, 1 second. 1 second.
Shake it up.
Shake it up.
It sounds
Shake, shake, shake. Go down. Shake your body. Okay. Ready? Close your eyes. Pick one. Okay, who's our lucky winner?
306.
If your last numbers are 306, awesome. Okay, we have some lovely swag for you. Let's give a cheer. So, if you go to the registration table, you can pick up your gear. I think this time they gave us a small growler bottle, a scarf, a hat, which is perfect. It's going to snow tonight, so they say. funds. All of the public programs that we do, we fund ourselves. So we ask that you support us. We are accepting donations. You can give here at the Humanitini or you can give online. And we hope that you will continue to come out and continue to support us as you are able. Thank you so much.
Wait,
Oh, he's reminding me to say my relatives. Okay, so first we have my lovely mommy, Claudia. She's just coming back from Colombia, South America. I haven't seen her for almost 3 months, so I'm so happy she's home. And then my beautiful boy, Diego. He's a little shy. Okay, Jay, it's your turn.
Thank you. My pen exploded. I don't normally have it. Okay, my cousin, Garrett Martin, is here. He's the family doctor. We're all very proud of that. And my Aunt Sharon is sitting right there. From Deal, Maryland, which is a very small town close to Annapolis. All right, thank you all very much for coming.